Okay, so we may as well get started. So welcome everyone to the OERC Seminar series. So today we've got Kiti Suomalainen. She's a research fellow at the Energy Centre at the University of Auckland. She's been there since 2013, except for a short stint where she actually came down here to the Centre for Sustainability for a year and a half and worked with Janet and myself on a research project. Now she's back at the centre up in Auckland, and Kiti's going to be talking to us today about climate change and hydro in New Zealand, which is obviously a very topical topic right at this moment, but she's going to be talking about the impacts of long-term energy system planning. So we've got a little bit of a hybrid process going on here with Kiti zooming in from Auckland. So hopefully it all works, the technology all works. We'll, after about 45 minutes, we'll stop and have questions, and either via chat or online. Does that work for you, Kiti?
Yes. I think I was told 30-minute talking and 15 minutes then.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
And I think that might work better with Zoom, because otherwise you'll all zoom out.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks a lot. So I'll mute ourselves on this end and over to you.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Michael, and thank you for the invitation. As Michael said, I've been at the Centre for Sustainability before, so it's awesome to be back, even if I can't be there in person. And it's great to see from here, it looks like we've got a packed room and heaps of people online. So I'm thrilled that you all came even to just a Zoom presentation. So yeah, so today I'll talk about the so-called Times New Zealand model, which is an energy systems model for New Zealand, and how I applied it to long-term hydro planning under climate change, essentially. I'm conscious that we are on, hold on, I have to put my, there we go. On Zoom, so I didn't want to make this a very, very long monologue, because it's very difficult, I guess, to interrupt during the talk, or it can be tricky. So I think I've got 23 slides, and I'll try to keep it brief so that then we'd have just more time to have a discussion, because that's kind of the best part in these conversations and these presentations with a research centre like yourselves, or a group like yourselves. So I'll talk briefly about the background motivation, what brought this model about, and about Times as an integrated energy system modelling platform, how it works, what it does, and then the Times New Zealand model, how we did the study on hydro under climate change, and then also looking at the cost of decarbonisation with and without climate change impacts, and then a bit on the next step, so where we're heading from here. I think you are all quite aware of New Zealand energy system key characteristics. So just to put us on the same page here, the energy sector is of course responsible for 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. Our electricity is highly renewable, varying somewhere roughly 80–85%, I suppose. Was it 79% last year because of low hydro and lack of, well, that's not renewable, natural gas. And of course, that varies a lot because of the impact of hydro, which is seasonal in New Zealand. Geothermal has a big contribution there, close to 20%, I think, regularly. Wind, with new wind being installed, so is it 5 or 6% now? Then if we look at so that's the electricity sector. If we look at the other sectors, and that's where the greenhouse gases really come from. So electricity somewhat, and industry are the largest contributors of coal, or the largest coal users. I was surprised to see electricity there, but I think that became the largest single user last year when we've had low hydro and constraints on natural gas. So I guess the use of coal in electricity varies from year to year, quite really depending on other factors, whereas in industry it's more constant, and that's where we more seriously need to abate. Transport is the largest oil user. So just looking at the big picture, we essentially have the emissions coming from natural gas and coal in the use of, or for process heat, and then oil in the transport sector. So looking at the electricity sector alone doesn't really encompass all of that, although electrification is widely seen as the key enabler to transition those other sectors away from fossil fuels. So hence, we have the need to do this type of energy systems modeling that encompasses the entire energy sector and can really model the transitions involving all sectors within the economy. So hence, that's where energy systems modeling then comes in. So it's really an approach to energy or energy sector that looks at the interlinked system rather than a set of elements that can then be modeled individually. So really looking at the system as a whole, and this will then give you insights on substitution options that will be linked to the system as a whole and can't be understood if you just look at one technology or one area of the system, such as the transport sector or the electricity sector. So as an example, fuel shifting and technology change may have impacts across the whole sector, and that's what we really are interested in. Example there is the EVs, of course. So if we have EVs, that will have an impact on electricity generation, most likely have an impact on electricity prices, which then in turn can have an impact on, for example, space heating fuel in the residential sector. So can we still afford electricity, or do we switch to perhaps biomass pellets or coal in the worst case? So that's the kind of interlinks between the sectors that I'm looking at, what I'm really interested in. And of course, on the policy side, then you really want to understand the impacts of technology bans or fuel bans or taxes or subsidies. What might that be across the whole sector before you actually put them in place? So hence you want something that will simultaneously include both supply side, demand side, and all the demand sectors and all the energy resources on the supply side as well, so that you really start seeing where the impacts occur in the system. Just to place the model in a bigger picture. So the model I'm talking about today is an bottom-up energy systems model as circled there. So that's a Times New Zealand model. That's where it kind of fits in. So it's not a CGE, it's not an aggregated model. It's more of a bottom-up approach. It does take demand projections from the likes of the top-down model, CGE models on the right-hand side, and then inputs on technologies or fuels might come from the left-hand side of that circle. But essentially it's up there in terms of purpose. So the y-axis there would be is decision-making hierarchy. So this is really for long-term strategic planning of the energy system. What do we want to invest in? What should we build? Where and when in a long-term time horizon? So it's not in any way looking at how should we operate the energy system. It will give us insights on that or give us information on that, but it's not it's not the purpose of the model. It's long-term energy system planning. And a bit about the Times New Zealand background. So this project started in 2018, the first phase, and the objective was really to make a full energy system model for New Zealand so that we have a long-term integrated, to perform long-term integrated energy analysis, so to say. This was an initiative from the Business NZ Energy Council. That's where it started, and then had collaboration across the energy sector, so from private investors, BEC members, Sapir Consulting, so you probably all know Steve Batstone, he was managing the project. ICA is now involved, particularly in the second phase of the project. Paul Scherrer Institute is a research institute in Switzerland that really came with the Times modeling capabilities and the experience to build this model for New Zealand. And then of course us, the Energy Centre at the University of Auckland, to be the academic partner on our side, on the New Zealand side. This represents the scope of the Times New Zealand model in a nutshell. So on the right side, we have the energy demand sectors. In the model, we have 5 demand sectors. That's residential and services. Those are 2 different sectors. They're here in one lumped because they essentially have pretty much the same technologies and the same types of energy service demands. Then we have transport, industry, and agriculture. Industry and agriculture are in this model still modeled at a aggregated fuel demand level. So not in terms of technologies, but residential and transport and services are all have different technologies for the model to choose from. But we don't really want technologies. We want energy services as consumers from any of those sectors. We really want things such as heating, cooling, lighting, etc., mobility. And hence that's what the exogenous input to the model is in terms of demand projections. And that comes from macroeconomic drivers such as GDP, population, etc. I'll show those assumptions in the next slide, I think. So that's what the model gets as the input, and then it will decide or optimize the rest of the system in terms of technologies. So at the far left side, you then have the energy resources, renewables, fossil fuels, and those will be characterized in terms of reserves, availability, in terms of the time resolution of the model. And in between, then you have all the transformation technologies. So electricity generation, fuel refining, and to some extent the transmission and distribution of electricity and fuels, or energy carriers, so to say. So you have the supply side technologies, demand side technologies, and the demands at the very right side and the resources at the very left side. And the purpose of the model is to find the most cost-effective long-term solution for how to optimize the system. So which technologies to use, which resources and technologies to use over the entire time horizon. So let's look at that. I mentioned the energy service demands. So this is the input to the model, how we assume energy service demands to grow over time. This does not necessarily mean it's the energy demand, because of course the model can choose more efficient technologies, and hence the actual delivered energy might be lower, but the energy service would be the same. Essentially, this is a baseline scenario that I developed, which for the residential sector just looks at Stats New Zealand projections on population and household size. For the commercial and industrial sectors, we use GDP projections from NZIER, the New Zealand Institute for Economic Research. Transport, we use Ministry of Transport, the base scenario, which then has assumptions on GDP and population growth from Stats New Zealand as well, so it fits very well. For agriculture, again, we use NZIER, the agriculture sector, and yes, just an exception we did for industry, so food processing, we also used agriculture GDP growth projection rather than manufacturing. So this is kind of how we're seeing the economy to grow, and hence energy service demands as well. And it's quite, I don't think there's anything really surprising. The commercial sector is growing fastest, whereas the industrial sector is actually here assumed to contract a little bit. So the times modeling platform, what does a times model do? So this comes from the IEA Energy Technology Systems Analysis Program. This program is an international program involving, I think, 20-something odd countries, has been going for maybe 20 years or so. So it's a long-term program, and they have different tools for energy modeling. Times is the current, actually an evolution from the Markov model that was used previously. I won't go into that, but Times is currently the main energy systems model that's come out of this program. It's used in numerous countries and often for policy support, kind of national level energy systems modeling and policy support. There is an EU-wide Times model as well, Times EU, that then looks at all the different countries. But that's beyond the scope. So what it does, it is just a linear programming optimization tool. So it is quite simple as a model, which is an advantage because it is a bottom-up model and has a lot of data in it. So linear programming is generally the quickest way to get a solution. It's a cost minimization tool, so it will look at the entire time horizon and all sectors of the economy, so the entire energy sector, and finds the least cost solution. So essentially the lowest net present value of the system. It has perfect foresight, which means we have to give it all the data assumptions for the future. And that means technology costs, how we assume solar technologies to decrease over time or something else to go up, the carbon price, we have to give those assumptions if we assume there's a carbon price. Efficiencies, how we assume battery efficiencies to improve over time, etc. So it gets all that data, and in order to look at uncertainty, you really have to then just create, make sensitivity analysis or that kind of approach for, to study uncertainties. It takes the social planner perspective, which is an economic term, essentially saying it's not optimizing for any stakeholder or any agent in particular. It is looking at the whole system as a whole, as one entity, and wants everyone to be better off. And what it gives is then so it endogenously gives you the investment decisions, what to install, where and when, given the technical parameters, economic and policy parameters, and bounds. And that's essentially what is said in the boxes on the right-hand side as well. So it minimizes the total discounted system costs over the entire time horizon and all technologies involved in the entire energy system, supply and demand side. So that includes capital cost, operation and maintenance costs, fuel costs, costs from imports, minus then revenues from exports, all emissions costs that you have decided to model. Times New Zealand has only CO2 because we're only looking at the energy sector. I think only for, well, CO2 equivalents essentially, mainly CO2, and I think for geothermal it would be a CO2 equivalent because there are a few other emissions there as well. Minus then salvage value, so because it's a long-term investment model, it goes up to 2060. And if something is invested in the last 5 years, for example, it will understand that there's still value left there after the end of the time horizon. So that's the salvage value. And what it gives out, what it spits out is the investment. So how much money you're investing in each year or in each period that you're modeling, the installed capacities, energy output per technology. So I said it's not really an operational model, but it will give you how much of each technology you're using. So you might have a constraint that says we need so and so much of thermal, minimum of thermal, but it might not be using it. So it will give you all those outputs as well. CO2 emissions, imports and exports of whatever energy carriers you might include. And then of course, everything subject to constraints. So you'll have the constraints on resources, constraints on technologies. Perhaps you can't import more than a certain number of cars per year. Perhaps you can't import more than a certain number of EVs per year. So all those physical constraints, as well as then policy constraints. So you can have cost constraints or you can have cost scenarios. And often the scenario that you build will be built on constraints as well. So you might constrain something, you're not allowed to build as much of something else as your baseline scenario. So you might have a more wind-oriented scenario or a more hydrogen-oriented scenario, whatever. So all that is then usually built through constraints. The time resolution. So this is not a time series model, really. It has a model horizon and we model certain periods in that model horizon. So we have 2015 and 2018 as reference years or as calibration years. And then from 2020, we go to 2060 in 5-year periods. So we essentially model a representative year every 5th year. And for each representative year, we have 24 time slices in this model. This means we have 4 seasons. For each season, we have weekdays and weekend days. So we can get the difference between peaks and demands during weekdays and weekend days. And at the daily level, we have day, night, and peak modeled. So this is a representative time period approach rather than a time series. So it is not a dispatch model if that's what you're kind of if that's in your head. The peak period there is very important And it's not an average either because of the peak period. So the peak you really need to model as the absolute peak of that time period and not the average peak. And that ensures that your model will build enough capacity to reach that peak. So hence it's not really an average, it's a representative time period or a time resolution. Then if we go to the two topics that I'm looking at today. So the first one is climate change impact on hydro. And this started with, well, NIWA has done these maps that I'm showing now. So they have modeled the impact of climate change on precipitation in different areas of New Zealand, as seen in this map. So we have spring, summer, autumn, and winter. And you can see by the different colors, you'll have different impacts of climate change. So this is a RCP 8.5 scenario. That's a RCP is the representative concentration pathway. And 8.5 is, can I say, the most severe climate change scenario. At least a couple of years ago, we were still very much heading towards this scenario if nothing was done. And I'm not sure if we're very far off from it still globally speaking. But this was just taken as an example to be kind of the more extreme climate change scenario. And then I did sensitivities around that. So I'll show you that in a bit. But the point here is that we have 4 seasons. NIWA has done the modeling on climate change impact on precipitation, and then we took it from there. So work from Goldman Zakari and a student whom I was working with in the beginning of this project. So they looked at the historical lake levels and the major catchments, which include 90% of New Zealand hydro capacity. And they looked at the climate data from NIWA, the precipitation data from NIWA, and then looked at the expected change under the different RCP scenarios, including then a snowmelt model. And their results included the availability factors. So rather the percent difference in availability of hydro in the different catchments at a seasonal level. And their data was on per catchment, and I needed it per island because the Times New Zealand model has 2 regions, the South Island and North Island. So I needed to aggregate that data to per island level. And I looked at I did that by weighting the expected changes by the hydro capacity installed in each catchment. So I could get then the impact on North Island and South Island hydro. So this is the baseline what I started from. And this gives the RCP 8.5 result for 2035, essentially saying that in winter on both islands, we will have more hydro available. And if we look at the South Island, both in spring and summer, we'll have less hydro available. And this then has to do with the precipitation coming more as rain rather than snow. So rather than being stored for the winter and then trickling down during spring and summer, it will kind of be available immediately when it comes. And the blue one is North Island, a bit more rain available in summer, but less in fall and spring. Just to note, of course, New Zealand demand peaks in winter. So the increased hydro availability in winter on both islands looks kind of good. And also that most of our hydro capacity is on the South Island, and hence significantly less, roughly 12% less hydro available in summer can have an impact, of course. So that's kind of, those are the things we want to keep an eye on. And if we then go directly to our results, first, installed capacity. So let's have a look. I have the RCP 8.5 scenarios going from 0.0, 0.5, 1.0, 1.5. I did them at higher increments, but just to not show, just to show something that's easier to look at, I show these extremes. So the 0.0 means there is no climate change. 1.5 means there's heaps of climate change. 1.0 is the expected. So the ones from the graph, this graph. And 0.5 then means something in between. So those are actually the direct multipliers to the change in availability factors for hydro. And if we look at solar, the red shows no climate change and the purple shows heaps of climate change essentially. So we're seeing that with the high climate change scenario, we're installing a lot more solar, particularly in the North Island, and less wind then. So we're kind of saying that solar is favored at the expense of wind in the increasing climate change scenarios. The more climate change impact we have, the more solar the model chooses to install. And that kind of makes sense with the assumptions, with this figure here saying that we have more hydro available in winter, and of course we have less solar then, and we have 12% less solar available, hydro available in summer. So the solar is kind of compensating for that. So that's an interesting output from the installed capacity side. If we then look at the generation, it's kind of showing the similar, well, it shows how it makes sense. So again, we have the 4 seasons, North Island, South Island in the 2 big rows, and then the different climate change scenarios. And if we look at the South Island winter, we'd have heaps more hydro here, which was according to the scenario, according to the assumptions of the changes in availability factors. And then in summer, we have less hydro available, and that is then compensated here. So if we go up, we have more climate change, no climate change, and then 1.5 is more climate change, so to say. And we'll see that is here compensated by solar. So you'll get more solar in summer on the North Island when we have less hydro available in the South Island. The interesting thing here is, which might be lack of an appropriate constraint, is that we have natural gas in fall. So this is kind of where we're lacking. We don't have the resources available to do it with renewables. And we'll see on the North Island, we have slightly less hydro available in fall, and it's deciding to use natural gas for that. However, it's not using natural gas so much in the other periods, in the other seasons. And I'm not sure if that's really realistic way to use natural gas. So in reality, if this were to occur, that might be coal, because coal is easy to just store in a pile outside your plant, whereas natural gas is a bit more difficult. Let me see how much time I have. The cost of decarbonisation. So this is the second scenario, or the second study that I wanted to look at. So looking at decarbonisation from 50% to 80%, and this is the energy sector, not the entire economy. The target is to decrease the total energy sector CO2 emissions by 2050 by these different amounts, starting from 50. And that's from 2005 levels. And then to estimate the cost, I look at the difference in the total system cost versus the difference in CO2 emissions. So I get how much is mitigated, how much less do we have emissions, and how much did that cost on the entire system. And hence I get a $1 per ton value. And this is just a reminder, you've seen this graph a million times. So we're only looking at the energy related emissions here, including transport and manufacturing, but only the energy related emissions, not chemical feedstocks from coal or other emissions. And this shows the emissions reductions to 2060. The target was 2050, so that's where it heads, and then it stabilizes. And you'll already see the blue dots are when there's no target at all. And the emissions decrease quite dramatically anyway. This is mainly because of the transport sector, because a model like this will always prefer EVs as the cost-effective option without really considering our range anxieties and other fears we have for EVs. So it is a very rational model. Of course, the target is net zero carbon by 2050. So we would still need to abate the last emissions. But this was really to look at existing technologies, existing solutions, and where we can go without really pushing the model to an absolute extreme, because I don't have those solutions in the model yet. And you really want to do that in a very careful and realistic way if you want to go to more extreme values. Notice this is not electricity, this is the entire energy system. So if we look at the average and marginal cost of decarbonisation, this is quite interesting. So let's spend a little bit of time. So I'm applying a 5% discount rate here. we go from 50 to 80% total emissions reduction. That's actually wrong, it's not 1990, it's 2005. And the first two bars always give the average. One is without climate change, and the other one is then assuming the climate change scenario 1.0. And then we have the marginal cost, so the cost for the last step, so from 70 to 75 or 75 to 80. So we'll see, to get to an 80% reduction from 2005 level emissions, the average cost is about $30. And the marginal cost for that last 5% would be roughly $85 to $90 in this model. And that's, yeah, that's not ridiculous at all. That is quite cheap, most of you would probably say. So happy to discuss that, but I'm also conscious we still have a bit of time. I'm just trying to see how many slides I have left. Yeah, I'll go through these results before and then we can discuss more on the price, I think, in questions. Fuel shifting in transport. Let me explain this graph again. So we have diesel, petrol, and electricity available in the transport sector and the different time horizons. And essentially we're seeing that with all the different emissions reduction targets, petrol is essentially phased out. And that's what you saw in a few slides ago when we looked at the total emissions. Even without reductions, even without targets, the emissions will reduce quite drastically. And that's because it chooses electricity over petrol for the light duty vehicles. So that kind of goes without putting a target on it. The interesting bit here comes in the last, going towards 2050 and going from 60 to 70, 80% reductions. And that's where you then start seeing that it will move from diesel, so that's heavy transport, to electricity. And that's then buses and trucks. And that's where the marginal cost comes in as well. So that's where that cost is coming from. Industry, as I mentioned, is only modeled here in terms of fuel demands, and there was some flexibility given there. So this is not modeled in any great detail. There was some flexibility for it to do some fuel switching, and you basically see that it is switching from, well, in all scenarios, it is essentially switching away from coal and natural gas, or at least decreasing, but that is also has to do with the assumption that industry demands in general are decreasing. And then it is switching to electricity and biomass. And at the very last level of targets, so going from 70 to 80% reduction, it will actually go from biomass to electricity. Have that peak there. So to wrap up in one very full slide of insights, before going to next steps, essentially, I'm saying that this type of energy systems modeling approach is really needed when we want to understand the transitions between fuels, between technologies, and behaviors as well, although this is a poor example of behavior, especially looking at the EVs. So we're not really seeing that unless we want to model that specifically, then we can use something like this. But really to look at the impacts across the energy sector of policies and transitions. Regarding the climate change impact on hydro, we saw that we had higher winter availability, both islands, which really then decreases our reliance on fossil fuels. So that's great. Lower availability in summer, South Island particularly, well, mainly only. And that was then the reason why we saw an increase in solar capacity rather than wind, at the expense of wind. But again, my little disclaimer here, this is a long-term energy systems model, so it does not take into account that any day-to-day volatility or seasonal volatility. And I certainly don't know what the precipitation pattern might look like. Will it be nice and average over my whole assumed time period, or will it come in shocks that might mean that we may need to spill anyway when it's available? So it might not be available at this level as assumed here. So that's just something to keep in mind. And it may, of course, have more severe consequences than the rosy picture kind of presented here. Decarbonisation, this model shows, this simple assumption to the energy system change showed that we could reach 80% reduction with a cost of 85 to 90% for that last 5%. And I do need to say that energy system changes very slowly. So just if we suddenly put a carbon tax of $90, that does not mean we would get to this result. In my view, that is my interpretation. And of course, there are sunken costs. There are existing power plants that are probably still paying their finances, their investments. So none of that can be shifted as quickly as this model would assume. This is a pure cost-effective techno-economic model that will just change things overnight if it can. But having said that, New Zealand is well positioned to reach significant emissions reductions. From the pure techno-economic perspective, we have solutions. These are all the solution technologies in this model are, available now, and no dramatic assumptions have been made there. So if we can go to 80% at a reasonably low cost, I think that's quite promising. Then the question is how to actually get there. But we have all the technical solutions, I would say. And again, emphasizing that the energy sector changes quite slowly. So the decisions we make now will be in place for a very long time. And hence we need to make the correct ones now. Next step, so this is my last slide with text, is about the NZ's model. So I was involved in the Times New Zealand modeling for the first phase of it. And then we decided we wanted our own model. So we had the freedom to do the research we want. So then I started developing the New Zealand Integrated Energy Systems model, the NZ's model. And that's then developed and owned by the Energy Centre for research, educational purposes. The main difference in terms of time resolution to the Times New Zealand model is that I'm modeling 1 day per season, and each day would be at an hourly level, so 24 hours per day. So full season, 24 hours for a day in the season. And that will then enable me to better include the patterns of both supply side renewables, such as solar, which is quite important, and then demands as well. So if we want to look at behavioral side of things like EV charging, then we can kind of include that dynamic at a representative level into the model. Currently, this model is being used or will be used in AGN a science-led project called Green. Well, it has a massive title, but I just call it the Green Hydrogen Project. And this is to really understand the potential of hydrogen in the energy system. So we're currently working on that. That's a 5-year project. And from my perspective, the objective of developing this model, this NZ's model for the Energy Centre, is really so that we have a New Zealand specific energy systems model that's ready for answering any and a range of questions that come up, over the year. We always have a couple of hot topics, and it would be nice to just be able to put some assumptions into the model and see what comes out and have a more numbers-based conversation, I suppose, rather than guessing your way. But this is where I will finish. And shall we try and see how we can take questions and answers?
Okay, thank you very much, Kiti. Okay, so I think what we'll do is, I haven't seen any questions on the chat yet, so we'll take any questions from this audience here now. So who would like to kick off?
If you're in,
you might need to come up a little bit. It kind of gets echoey too far back. Thank you.
I note that your modelling system suggests that the lower hydro in spring and summer should be substituted with solar, but we seem to be talking about pumped hydro in the current public and government environment, which is not what you were suggesting. Would you discuss that?
This modelling was done mainly in 2020 20, I think. I think I had a large scale hydro there assumed as an option, but I can't remember from the top of my head what the cost for it was, and if it was particularly, it wasn't particularly for Lake Onslow, so I wouldn't have put those numbers in. And yeah, this model did not choose it at this stage. It would be, of course, interesting to make a more detailed characterization of Lake Onslow and put that as an option. But at this stage, yeah, that was not chosen, no. But yeah, I'd have to check the numbers to see if it was, how close it would have been to our current estimates. I mean, we're still waiting for the results from the battery project to see what those assumptions might look like. So until then, it's just a guessing game of what it might cost and what numbers you could put there. But yeah, that's the kind of questions that I would like to be able to quickly answer with a model like this, absolutely. But yeah, when I did this modeling, Lake Onslow storage wasn't as big on the agenda as it is currently.
So just following on from that, Kitty, how do your results compare with, say, the climate change modelling, the Climate Change Commission modelling that carried on? Are they directly comparable, or?
Well, it's hard to compare because I haven't seen their results and their modeling in detail. So and because as I said, I did this is a bit old already, and I'm currently building the NZ's model. So I haven't gone into such detail into actually looking at that. I'd rather do that with the new model where I'm putting in all the inputs and know exactly what's going on. Essentially, there are similarities in them looking at the transport sector, for example, that they would go highly electric, and that's kind of what most of these models seem to be giving. So I guess the main questions there is, what are the constraints in terms of importing EVs and such? Because these techno-economic models tend to kind of just favor EVs from the cost effectiveness perspective. Others, yeah, I didn't make a detailed comparison, so I can't really say much.
Can I ask a quick follow-on question? So when you say that the models tend to favour EVs in terms of the cost, does that mean they favour them over public transport and other options? Or?
Essentially, in this case, no, because in this case, that's an public transport versus private vehicles is an external assumption. And that's something you'd want to model in more detail or do a different project to understand that dynamic. So essentially from the MOT scenarios, we get a certain demand for buses, a certain demand for passenger rail, a certain demand for light duty vehicles or passenger car transport. So that is not, yeah, that doesn't come from the model. So we'd have to do quite a different modeling around that, looking at passenger kilometers traveled rather than vehicle kilometers traveled. So yeah, the model doesn't choose where to put passengers in terms of public transport versus private. That comes from the inputs to the model in this case.
So the inputs to the model in this case, we're just assuming business as usual, essentially. Is that right? It's just the
yeah. We're not assuming a shift to higher public transport or anything like this. This is the base scenario from MOT for transport. So that would be something of a baseline scenario.
Okay.
Janet's first.
Hi Kitty, Janet here. Sorry, I was a bit late into your talk, so I missed the first part, but when I came in not long after, you were starting to talk about the carbon price assumptions. And what I'm interested in is the model, what is the role of carbon pricing within the model? So is your model saying if we had a carbon price of $90 a tonne, then it would drive these kinds of changes with energy systems much faster than this price per tonne. So is it kind of anticipating those policy options as part of the model?
Yes, but we have to be quite careful in making that interpretation. So essentially from the pure economics perspective, that's essentially exactly what it's saying. If we put the target, we need to decrease emissions to a certain level, and then we get the cost of that. And those are the costs that I was showing. And that would, from an economics perspective, that would be exactly the same as a carbon price set to reach that target. But of course, we know that a carbon price alone might not get us there. So that's the caveat of it, that the actual economy and our actual system is more complex than that, and carbon price alone might not get us there, is my view.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, in the model, we can either put a carbon tax and see what is the result on emissions, or we can put a target on emissions or an emissions cap and say what's the cost of reaching that.
I'm not from the topic, so I sometimes have understanding issues. Can you go to the slide before the decarbonization cost, which had all this hydro and so on versus each other? Yeah, the slide before. No, what? Yeah, next.
This one?
No, this one, yeah. But I don't really understand this here. It's all about electricity, right?
This slide is all about electricity, yes.
Yes. And you have a gigawatt scale, but
Gigawatt hours.
Gigawatt hour scale. And now you make for some future scenario, right? How it would change. But what I don't understand is the electricity as a total has to go up by a factor 5 or so, I guess. So this is, will it not completely change the picture? I mean, for example, the power in South Island, you cannot make 5 times bigger than it is now.
Sorry, this is gigawatt hours. Not
Yes.
Is this one time in the future though, Kiti?
I think this would be 2035. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have the year for the output, but I think it's 2035.
Do we have 5 times more gigawatt hydro than today, for example?
Not in gigawatts, no. But
Yeah,
we will have more hydro output.
But if you replace petrol and diesel and so on by electricity, when you need to increase this number, but you might have geological limits there.
Yeah, those would be in the model. I mean, here we're changing the availability factor of hydro to the existing capacity. So the availability of hydro, which is seasonal, I mean, the hydros are not running at 100% all the time, right? So they have seasonal fluctuations and they have seasonal availability in relation to their total installed capacity. And these factors here on the right-hand side graph are applied to the existing availability factors of hydro per island. So that will change with this.
But hydro is more than 50% in your scenario, which would, in my opinion, require a redoubling or whatever of existing capacity, which I'm not knowing as an outsider if this is possible.
I'm not understanding what's doubling.
No, I think what the point
This
is
is the installed capacity, and we have roughly a bit under than.
Yeah, exactly. It's constant here.
So it stays the same. Yeah.
You have to increase your electricity by a factor 5, I guess, if you want to replace.
Yeah, so we're putting a lot more solar and wind in these scenarios. You can see that.
Not in the next slide. It's marginal. Hydro is the marginal. It's next slide. It's almost everything right here. All the other doesn't matter.
This is in that 1 year. So this is over time. This is different climate change scenarios in 1 year in the future.
When is the Hungary coal plant being decommissioned? It's not in these.
I didn't include it because, yeah, it wasn't significant. It wasn't part of, anything interesting per se. So here it didn't even show. I think it was, it would have been gone according to the model 2030 to 2035, somewhere in that scenario.
Can somebody answer my simple question? 2045, how much more electricity do you need compared to today?
I don't have that number. I don't remember the number for that.
It's a key number. It must be the model. I would think it's 4 times more, otherwise we cannot get rid of oil, etc. If you have 4 times more electricity, how can you have a majority being still red without expanding capacity?
There is capacity expansion, and this is only the main ones, yeah.
Gigawatt hours constant in hydro.
That's not over time. This is 1 year. So this is not
2045, I think.
Yeah, but there's an increase in hydro generation in 2035.
Is it a factor of 5 or factor of 3? I don't see this graph shows
It's a
constant.
factor of about 20%.
What 20%?
20%, no more. Might even only be 10%. But it's not
Why
5 times, 4 times, or
Why is
20
this 20%? That's all right.
Yeah, it is close to 1.5.
What?
So 1.5 times the amount of electricity we now produce, we needed to
How much?
decarbonise.
What is your electricity fraction of your energy mix in New Zealand?
40%.
40% now.
Of what?
Electricity of total energy. Now.
It's about 40% and 60% fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And he's asking
So
the correct
it's just
question.
a doubling basically.
Except for efficiency.
We're trying to displace, but we're not trying to increase hydro.
Except for efficiency.
It's not a one replace.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's not a
this
one
number
to
is much less in other countries.
there's a huge efficiency gap. Go down.
What about the lack of snow melt in the future years? I mean, it's going to impact on
Okay, so Kitty, we've got a question about snow melt. Is that something that was part of your analysis?
Yeah, so that came from the previous results from Goldman and her student. Let me just. So here you can see that they've included the snowmelt model, which then means that a lot more of the precipitation is available directly in winter rather than less in spring and summer in the South Island. So that was included in my inputs, what I received as inputs in the availability factors. So that availability factors for hydro that I received, those include the snowmelt model.
Okay, so we've got some questions online. So, well, one answer.
Awesome, thank you, Rafferty.
Rafferty says it would not be 5 times, close to 1.5. Chris?
I think someone in the room also said that, yeah, perfect.
And also, we've got a question here from Ian Mason. So he says, excellent talk. His question is about the additional electricity needed for green hydrogen generation that is presently having much enthusiasm. Do you include that? Do you include that in your model?
So that will be part of the development of the NZ's model, yes, and part of the. So the GNS Science-led green hydrogen project there is all about hydrogen in the energy system, and that's where we are then. That what we're now developing and putting it into the model so that we have all the reasonable techno-economic parameters correctly modeled along the entire energy system. So from the production of hydrogen to storage and transport of hydrogen to then demand side sectors. And that's the big challenge now for us to include in the model. So yeah, we're working on that and with much enthusiasm.
So was, that wasn't included in your models so far?
Not in this one. I think there was an option for hydrogen, but we didn't really have the demand side technology. So there wouldn't be much. I think there may have been some in the cars, but at this stage, the assumptions didn't really go that. Yeah, it wasn't really picked here. I think there were assumptions for hydrogen production and then some options for hydrogen cars and trucks, if I remember correctly. At this stage, yeah, the model didn't pick them. They still favored electricity. But I think, yeah, that would need to be done in more detail, more robust cost assumptions.
So we'll just have one last question, Kitty, and this has come from Jen Purdy. So she's asking, you found an increase in natural gas use in autumn. So I guess your modelled electricity generation is not 100% renewable, is that right?
That is right. So I did not assume any requirements for the electricity model here. I did a conference talk on that earlier, right before COVID, at the beginning of last year, where I looked at going towards 100% renewable electricity versus putting constraints on the entire energy system decarbonisation. And that kind of showed an artificial switch to wind and electricity demands to 35, after which it then decided to go back to biomass and others. So as other models have also shown, it didn't seem to be the best way to go. So no, I didn't include that here because this was, I didn't want to put too many things in one. So this was more about total energy system decarbonisation.
So just to be clear, that the natural gas in your model is for electricity generation rather than...
Yes. So that was all about electricity generation. And that's where I would put the disclaimer, where is that one? Here, that using, if we look at the top line, North Island RCP 1.5, 8.5 up 1.5, it's using quite a bit of natural gas in fall and not in the other seasons. And that's where I should probably have a chat with Jen to talk about whether that's realistic or not. I'm guessing it's not realistic. So in reality, as I mentioned, that would probably be coal if we needed something there, or it could be something else, something that's storable. And that's perhaps where Lake Onslow, something like that could have an impact, because that might not be natural gas in actual fact, in reality, if that makes sense.
Okay, so I might just bring... Sorry.
Quickly get away from that slide.
On that question, because that slide you're showing was 2035. What happened in 2050? Did that gas come back down, or did it continue to increase?
The use of natural gas?
Yes.
I cannot remember, to be honest. That would purely depend on what your assumption is, whether it was banned or not. If it's available, then most likely it will keep natural gas in the system, if nothing else comes along. And in this version, I didn't have anything specific magical coming along. So it would most likely use natural gas if it was allowed to, but I cannot fully remember the 2050 install capacities or operations.
So thank you very much for your talk, Kitty. You've generated lots and lots of questions. So that's perfect. So thank you very much, and we'll thank you all again here. And
thank you all for coming.
And so this will be put up online if anyone wants to view the slides in more detail at a later stage. So thanks a lot.
Good. All right. Thanks, Michael. Thank you, everyone.